Hello, everyone, and welcome to the most terrifying story you would come across today. Most of us fear the dark. It is a primal instinct, hardwired into our brains from thousands of years of evolution. But usually, when we turn off the lights, we know that the sun will eventually rise. We know that we can reach for a switch. But there are places on this planet where the sun never rises. Places where the darkness isn't just an absence of light, it is a physical weight. Underground spaces created by human hands that are just as dangerous, just as unforgiving, and in some cases, far more deadly than any natural cave system. Today's story takes us to a place where the earth itself seemed to turn against the men who carved it. A place where a single spark turned a labyrinth of tunnels into a chimney, and where the difference between life and death was measured in seconds. What happened in one Idaho mine serves as a chilling reminder that beneath the surface, even the most familiar places can turn hostile without warning. And sometimes, the most terrifying thing isn't what you find in the dark. It's the realization that you might never leave it. So, as always, viewer discretion is advised. The Golden Illusion. In the mid-1800s, the United States was gripped by a singular, intoxicating idea. That unimaginable wealth was buried just beneath the soles of your boots, waiting for anyone bold or desperate enough to claim it. When gold was discovered in California in 1848, it didn't just spark an interest, it triggered a mania. One of the largest mass migrations in American history began almost overnight. Men left reliable farms, abandoned their families, and walked away from entire careers. They traveled thousands of miles by foot, horseback, and wagon, crossing deserts and mountain ranges, all chasing a rumor. By some estimates, more than 150,000 people moved west in just a few years. But the reality was brutal. Most of them would never strike it rich. Many wouldn't even survive the journey, succumbing to disease, exposure, or starvation before they ever swung a pickaxe. By the mid-1850s, the dream was already fading. The easy surface gold, the nuggets you could pick out of a stream with your bare hands, had largely been exhausted. Prices dropped. Boom towns that had sprung up overnight emptied just as quickly, leaving behind ghost towns that still dot the landscape today. But the belief that wealth existed underground never truly disappeared. It only shifted. Instead of panning in rivers, men began to look at the mountains themselves. They began to dig deeper. In the fall of 1876, two brothers named True and Dennis Blake made the decision to head west. Very little is known about their early lives, but they were the archetype of the American drifter, men drawn by the promise that if they could just find the right spot, their fortunes would change forever. Their journey was anything but direct. For years, the Blake brothers drifted across the western United States, living hand to mouth. They worked the docks in Seattle, breathing in the salt air and sawdust. They moved inland to Spokane Falls, searching for farmland but finding nothing they could afford. They took dangerous jobs in lumber camps and sawmills, saving pennies while risking life and limb. By 1880, they turned their attention toward Idaho. It would take 4 long years of searching before they found their home. Near a remote creek, they established a modest homestead. At first, the land seemed unremarkable. There was no gold in the water, no obvious signs of wealth, just hard, rocky soil and endless trees. But one evening, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the valley, something caught their attention. A beam of sunlight hit a rock face high above the creek at the perfect angle. It didn't just glow, it flashed. Curious, and perhaps desperate for any sign of good news, the brothers climbed up to investigate. What they found would change the economy of the entire region. Embedded in the rock was an enormous silver deposit, one of the largest ever discovered in North America. Because they were originally from the northeastern United States, specifically Maine, they named the claim the Yankee Lode. It would later become known by a name that sounds tragically ironic given its dark future: the Sunshine Mine. The underground city, for decades, the Sunshine Mine produced silver at an extraordinary scale. As technology improved, the operation didn't just expand outward, it went down. By the 1970s, this wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was an industrial complex, an inverted skyscraper stretching nearly 1.5 miles into the crust of the earth. Over its lifetime, it would produce more than 360 million ounces of silver. To reach those deposits, miners carved a labyrinth of passages. We are talking about hundreds of miles of tunnels, shafts, drifts, and raises. Some levels reached depths of more than 6,000 feet. At that depth, the geology changes. The rock is under immense pressure. The natural temperature of the stone can reach 100 degrees Fahrenheit or more. It was an underground city, dark, loud, and dangerous. It had its own railway system, its own electrical grid, its own ventilation currents. It was a world entirely divorced from the surface. When you went down the shaft in the morning, you left the sun behind. You entered a world lit only by headlamps and string lights, filled with the deafening roar of pneumatic drills and the grinding of rock crushers. But to the men who worked there, it was just the office. They knew the tunnels like the back of their hands. They knew which shafts were drafty, which levels were hot. It was familiar. And for years, despite the inherent dangers of mining, the Sunshine Mine operated without a catastrophic loss of life. Until the morning of May 2nd, 1972. That day began like any other Tuesday. At the surface, the sun was shining. The foreman conducted a routine head count. One by one, 173 men lined up for the day shift at the jewel shaft. They joked with each other, adjusted their helmets, checked their lunch pails. Once everyone was accounted for, they stepped into the cages and began the long descent. They spread out across various levels, some at the 3,100-foot level, others going as deep as 5,600 feet. By late morning, the mine was humming. The air echoed with the sounds of production. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The smell of sweet death. Then, just before noon, the atmosphere shifted. The ground foreman, standing near the jewel shaft station deep underground, began to hear shouting. Now, yelling wasn't unusual in a mine. Communication was difficult amid the constant noise of ventilation fans and ore trains. You had to shout to be heard. But this time, the tone was different. There was panic in the voices. Two electricians working deep underground had detected something alarming. They smelled smoke. It wasn't the faint, oily odor that often accompanied diesel equipment. This was something heavier, stronger. It had a strange, chemical scent, almost sweet. We now know that this smell was likely burning polyurethane foam. This foam had been sprayed onto the walls of the tunnels to help seal them for ventilation efficiency. It was supposed to be fire retardant. It wasn't. The foreman immediately contacted mechanics stationed elsewhere in the mine. "Are you burning anything?" he asked. "Is there a torch running?" The answer was no. He ordered them to search for the source. The mechanics traced the smoke to the 3,700-foot level. What they found was a nightmare. The tunnels were filled with thick black smoke, but there were no visible flames. The fire was burning inside the walls, or perhaps behind old timber supports, fueled by the draft of the mine's own ventilation. At 12:03 p.m., the foreman realized this wasn't a small equipment fire. He grabbed the mine phone and ordered a full evacuation. "Get them out. Get everyone out now." But getting that message to 173 men, spread across miles of vertical and horizontal tunnels, proved nearly impossible. There were no cell phones, no public address system that reached every corner. The warning had to be passed by phone to key stations, and then by word of mouth. Many workers only realized something was wrong when the smoke physically hit them. And by then, it was often too late. The mine's ventilation system, designed to pump fresh air down to the workers, had turned into a weapon. The fire was located near the intake. The massive fans were now sucking deadly carbon monoxide and dense smoke into the mine and pushing it directly toward the working areas. Escape routes disappeared one by one. Men dropped their tools and ran toward the shafts, but they were running into a wall of black gas. The last hoist. Soon, only a single path remained viable. The jewel shaft. Miners from multiple levels began converging there, stumbling through the haze, wrapping shirts around their faces, hoping the cage would be there to take them up. The operator of the hoist at the number 10 shaft became the lifeline for dozens of men. As the smoke thickened around his station, he stayed at his controls. He could have run. He could have tried to save himself. But he knew that if he left that chair, the men below him were dead. He kept raising and lowering the cage, pulling groups of terrified men out of the deep levels and sending them toward the surface. For nearly an hour, the rescue continued. The cage would drop into the darkness, fill with coughing, soot-covered men, and rise again. Then, at 1:02 p.m., the hoist stopped. The men waiting at the lower levels rang the bell. No answer. They rang it again. Silence. What they didn't know was that the hoistman had finally succumbed. He had refused to leave his post until the carbon monoxide overwhelmed him. He died in his chair, his hand likely still near the controls. Without anyone to operate the lift, the rescue ended. Outside the mine, the scene was chaotic. Families were gathering at the gates. Wives, children, and parents stood staring at the jewel shaft entrance, where smoke was now billowing out into the daylight. At 1:30 p.m., a single miner emerged from the cage. He stumbled out, gasping for air. The crowd waited for the next man, but no one else followed. The 8-day nightmare. By the time specialized rescue teams arrived with oxygen tanks and protective gear, the mine was a tomb. The carbon monoxide levels were so high that even the rescuers were in danger. They moved slowly, checking level by level. They found bodies, lots of them. 91 men died that day. Many were found waiting calmly in line for the hoist that never returned. They had simply sat down and fallen asleep, killed by the odorless gas before the fire ever touched them. But deep in the mine, a miracle was unfolding in the dark. 2 men, Ron Flory and Tom Wilkinson, had not made it to the shaft. When the smoke hit, they realized they couldn't outrun it. Instead, they found a small pocket of clean air on the 4,800-foot level, nearly a mile underground. They were trapped. The air around them was poisonous. They had no lights. Their helmet batteries died within the first day. They were plunged into absolute crushing darkness. For 8 days, they sat there. Imagine that time frame. 8 days. 192 hours. They had no food. To survive, they crawled in the dark to the lunch pails of their deceased co-workers, scavenging leftovers. They drank water, dripping from a condenser pipe on the wall. Psychologically, it was torture. They could hear the distant sounds of rock popping and settling which sounded like gunshots in the silence. They experienced hallucinations. At times, they thought they saw lights. Worst of all, they could hear the rescuers. They heard the faint sound of the cage moving in the shaft far above them. They banged on the pipes with wrenches, trying to signal SOS. Clang, clang, clang. But no one came. Day 3 passed. Day 5, Day 7. They began to accept that they were going to die there. They spoke about their families. They made peace with their fate. Then, on the 8th day, a beam of light cut through the darkness. Rescue workers, sweeping the deep levels for bodies, didn't expect to find anyone alive. When they saw 2 figures moving in the shadows, they were stunned. Flory and Wilkinson were weak, dehydrated, and terrified. But they were alive. They were the only survivors from the deep levels. The Sunshine Mine disaster changed everything. It led to the Mine Safety and Health Act, mandating self-rescuers, portable oxygen supplies for every miner. Rules, as they say, written in blood. The miracle and the tragedy. But the Sunshine Mine isn't the only time the earth has swallowed men whole, only to spit them back out against the odds. In 1998, in Austria, a different kind of horror unfolded at the Lassing talc mine. This wasn't a fire, it was a collapse. The mine had been dug dangerously close to the surface, directly beneath a residential village. On July 17th, heavy rains softened the soil. The ground gave way, and millions of tons of mud and water poured into the mine shafts. A 20-year-old miner named Georg Heinzel was working alone when the collapse happened. He managed to scramble into a small timber-reinforced rest chamber as the mud sealed the exits. The collapse was catastrophic. It created a crater on the surface that began swallowing houses. A massive rescue operation was launched. 10 rescue workers descended into the mine to find Georg. But the mountain wasn't finished. A second, massive landslide occurred, filling the shaft the rescuers were in. All 10 men were killed instantly. The tragedy was unspeakable. 10 men dead trying to save one. And because the collapse was so severe, everyone assumed Georg was dead too. The operation switched from rescue to recovery. But Georg wasn't dead. Like Flory and Wilkinson, he was sitting in the dark. For 10 days. He had no food, he had no clean water. He later said he passed the time by disassembling and reassembling his headlamp in the dark, just to keep his hands busy. When an exploratory drill finally broke through into his chamber 10 days later, the operators were shocked to hear a voice. Georg Heinzel was pulled to the surface, bewildered but alive. It was called the miracle of Lassing, but it was a miracle bought at a terrible price. The boy in the well. The final story is perhaps the most heartbreaking because it didn't happen to a miner. It didn't happen in a place of industry. It happened on a sunny afternoon to a family having a picnic. In Spain, in early 2019, the Rosello family was trying to find peace. They had already lost one son to a heart defect years earlier. They were spending time in the countryside with their 2-year-old son, Julian. While playing, Julian wandered near an illegally drilled borehole. It was an exploratory well looking for water, only 10 inches wide. It had been left uncovered. In a split second, Julian slipped. He didn't just fall a few feet. He fell 360 feet, the height of a 30-story building, into a hole barely wider than a dinner plate. The rescue effort that followed captivated the world. It was an engineering impossibility. They couldn't go down the hole, it was too narrow. They couldn't dig directly next to it for fear of collapsing the soil onto the boy. Instead, they had to drill a massive parallel shaft through extremely hard granite. It was an operation that should have taken months, done in days. Elite miners from Asturias were flown in, men who specialized in collapsed coal mines. They descended the new shaft and hand-dug a horizontal tunnel toward where Julian was trapped. They used micro-explosives. They worked on their knees in cramped conditions, exhausted, driven by the cries of a family who had already lost too much. For 13 days, the world hoped. But when they finally broke through to the borehole, the silence was deafening. Julian had not survived the fall. 3 stories, 3 underground spaces, 1 fire, 1 collapse, 1 hole in the ground. They are all different, but they share a simple, terrifying truth. The earth beneath our feet is not solid. It is not static. It is a complex, shifting, and indifferent beast. Whether you are a professional miner deep in the silver veins of Idaho or a child playing in the Spanish countryside, the ground does not care who you are. These stories remind us of the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Men surviving in the dark for over a week, rescuers risking everything for strangers. But they also remind us of our fragility. So, the next time you walk into a basement or drive through a tunnel, take a moment to appreciate the light at the end of it. Because for some, that light never comes. If you made it this far, thank you for watching, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one.